Connecticut, December 25th. The dining room smells of pine needles and betrayal. My name is Madison Gray, and I am watching my father toast to his greatest business deal, selling my past for $250,000. He thinks I am the obedient daughter who will smile at the forgery he committed in my name. He believes he owns me. But in 5 minutes, I will take a knife to his investment and show this room full of wealthy strangers that some debts can only be paid by burning the ledger. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The snow was hard, and it came down in straight lines. It was not the soft kind of snow that covers things gently. It was the kind that bites and freezes and turns to ice as soon as it touches the ground. I drove the rental car a Ford with a heater that smelled like burning dust, and I watched the wiper blades scrape against the glass. The sound was a rhythm back and forth like a clock counting down time I did not want to spend. I was 28 years old, and I lived in a walk-up in Brooklyn where the radiator clanked and the light was gray and honest. But tonight, I was in Connecticut. The Merritt Parkway was empty, just the black asphalt and the white banks and the trees that looked like skeletons waiting for spring. I turned onto the private road. The tires crunched. The house sat on the top of the hill. It was a colonial white with black shutters, and it was lit up like a hotel. There were wreaths on every window, and garlands wrapped around the columns of the porch. It looked expensive. It looked perfect. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen, which meant it was a lie. I parked the Ford between a Mercedes and a Range Rover. The rental looked small and dirty next to them. It was coated in road salt. I turned the engine off and sat for a moment in the silence. The cold came through the glass. I felt the old tightness in my chest, the feeling of owing something I could not pay back. It was the debt of being a daughter in this house. I got out. The wind cut through my coat. It was a good coat wool, but it wasn't enough for this hill. I walked to the door, and before I could knock, it opened. My father stood there. Richard. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a face that was always flushed, as if he had just run a race or finished a heavy meal. He wore a tuxedo. The bow tie was black silk, and it was tied perfectly. He held a glass of scotch in his hand. "Madison," he said. He didn't smile. He just said the name, weighing it. "Hello, Dad." "You're late. The snow?" "The snow," I said. He stepped back, and I walked into the heat. The foyer smelled of pine needles and wood polish and the heavy, peaty smell of the scotch. It was stifling. My mother, Eleanor, came out of the living room. She was thin, and she wore a green velvet dress that reached the floor. She looked at me, starting at my boots and moving up to my hair. Her eyes were blue and sharp. She was looking for a flaw, and she found it in the scarf I was wearing. It was loose. "You look tired, Maddie," she said. She kissed the air next to my cheek. Her skin was dry and smelled of lavender. "I've been working," I said. "Painting," my father said. He said the word like it was a joke that had gone on too long. "Well, come in, everyone is here." I took off my coat and hung it in the closet. The hanger was wood, and it clicked against the rod. I smoothed my dress. It was black, simple, functional. It was a dress for a woman who worked. I walked into the living room. The fire was roaring in the stone hearth. The room was full of people. There were 20 or 30 of them standing in groups holding crystal glasses. I knew some of the faces. They were men my father did business with, men who sold bonds and insured ships and merged companies. The women were wives who managed calendars and charities. They wore diamonds that caught the light from the chandelier. The light was yellow and gold, and it made everything look rich and soft. I felt the separation. It was not just the money. It was the values. In my studio, value was what you created with your hands. It was the truth of a line, or the way light hit a cheekbone. Here, value was what you owned. It was what you could show to other people to make them envy you. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray. It was cold and dry. I drank it quickly. "Madison Gray," a voice said. It was Mr. Henderson. He was a partner at my father's firm, still doing the artist thing. "I am a painter, yes," I said. "Good for you," he said. He didn't mean it. He looked over my shoulder looking for someone more important. It's good to have hobbies, keeps the mind fresh. I moved away from him. I walked toward the far wall near the piano. I needed space. I looked at the walls. My parents collected art, but they didn't collect it because they loved it. They collected it because an advisor told them it would appreciate. They had Hudson River School landscapes and portraits of people they were not related to. But then I saw the gap. Above the mahogany sideboard there was a square of empty wall. The paint there was a shade lighter than the rest of the cream-colored room. A landscape of a valley had hung there for 10 years. Now it was gone. It looked like a missing tooth. It made the room feel off balance. I stared at the blank space. My father appeared beside me. He smelled of tobacco now, too. He followed my gaze to the empty spot. "Notice that, did you?" he asked. "Where's the Ken set?" I asked. "Sold it," he said. He took a sip of his drink. He looked happy. There was a shine in his eyes that I didn't like. It was the look he got when he had won a hand of poker. Cleared out a lot of things, old things, things that were just taking up space. "You liked that painting," I said. "I liked what it was worth," he corrected. "And tonight we have something better to celebrate. A real return on investment." He put a hand on my shoulder. His hand was heavy. He squeezed just a little too hard. It was possessive. "I'm glad you came, Madison. I know we don't see eye to eye on your lifestyle. But tonight is special. I think you'll finally understand what we've been trying to do for you." "What have you been trying to do?" "Build capital," he said. "Everything is capital, Madison, even you." He laughed a short bark of a sound and walked away toward the center of the room. He raised his glass to get the room's attention. The noise of conversation died down. The fire popped and hissed. I stood by the wall looking at the empty space. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the snow outside. I looked at the crowd. They were all watching him. They were wolves in silk and wool waiting for the meat. I was the only one who didn't know what was on the menu. I gripped the stem of my glass. The crystal was hard against my fingers. I waited for the axe to fall. The room was warm, but I was shivering. We moved into the dining room. It was a long room with a high ceiling and the table was set for 20. The tablecloth was white linen and it was stiff and clean. There were 3 forks on the left of each plate and 3 knives on the right. The crystal goblets were arranged in a diagonal line. The candles were tall and white and they burned without smoke. I found my place card. It was handwritten in calligraphy-heavy cardstock with gold edges. I was seated halfway down the table between a man I did not know and the guest of honor. The guest of honor was Arthur Sterling. He was a man composed of circles. His face was round. His stomach was round, and his hands were thick and soft. He wore a suit that cost more than my year's rent, a dark navy wool that absorbed the candlelight. He did not look at me when I sat down. He was looking at the center of the table, checking the label on the wine bottle. He had the air of a man who is used to buying things, and then checking to see if he was cheated. "You must be the daughter," he said. He didn't turn his head. He just spoke to the air in front of him. "I am Madison," I said. "Richard talks about you," Sterling said. He turned then. His eyes were small and dark and wet. "Says you're the creative one, the wild card." "I paint," I said. "Right, painting." He picked up his napkin and snapped it open. "I don't know much about art. I know what I like, and I know what holds value. That's the key, isn't it, holding value?" "It depends on what you value," I said. He laughed, a wet sound deep in his throat. "Money, dear. We value money. And things that turn into more money." Servants came out from the kitchen. They were silent and invisible. They poured the wine. It was a heavy red, a Bordeaux, thick and dark in the glass. They served the soup, a lobster bisque that smelled of cream and sherry. We ate. The sound of the room was the sound of silver hitting china. It was a rhythmic, aggressive clicking. People talked, but they didn't say anything. They talked about the winter in Aspen, and the summer in the Hamptons. They talked about market volatility and interest rates. They ate the soup, and they drank the wine, and they ignored the fact that it was Christmas. I ate mechanically. The spoon went into the bowl, then to my mouth, then back to the bowl. I tasted nothing. I felt the gaze of my mother from the end of the table. She was watching me eat, checking my posture. I sat up straighter. I drank the wine. It tasted of oak and tannins. It went to my head quickly because I hadn't eaten all day. The main course was roast beef. It was rare red in the center, swimming in a dark juice. The servants carved it at the sideboard. The smell of the meat filled the room. It was a primal smell masked by the scent of perfume and expensive candles. I cut into the meat. The knife was sharp. It sliced through the muscle without resistance. "This is excellent beef," Richard Sterling said. He had a piece of meat on his fork dripping red juice. "Prime." "Only the best, Arthur," my father said from the head of the table. "You know how I operate. Quality in everything." "Quality," Sterling repeated. He put the meat in his mouth and chewed slowly. He looked at me while he chewed. I looked down at my plate. The dinner went on. It felt like a play I had seen 100 times. The dialogue was scripted. The laughter was cued. I wanted to be back in my studio. I wanted to be smelling turpentine and linseed oil. I wanted the silence of the canvas. Here the noise was constant. It was a low hum of self-congratulation. When the plates were cleared, my father stood up. He held his wine glass. He tapped it with a spoon. The sound was sharp and it cut through the conversation. The room went quiet. All the faces turned toward him. He looked powerful standing there. The firelight cast his shadow long against the wall. "Friends," he said. "Colleagues. Family." He nodded to my mother, then briefly dismissively to me. "It is a joy to have you all here. Christmas is a time for reflection. But in our world, it is also a time for closing the books, for looking at the year and seeing the profit." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. "I have a special announcement tonight," my father continued. "A little victory that I want to share. You all know my daughter Madison." He pointed his glass at me. 20 pairs of eyes shifted to my face. I felt the heat rise in my neck. I didn't move. I kept my hands on the table, fingers laced together. "Madison has always been unique," he said. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "She went off to the city to be an artist. We worried, of course. We worried about her future. We worried about the investment." Some of the men chuckled. "But," Richard said, raising his voice, "I have always said that patience pays off. And I have always said that nothing in this house goes to waste. Years ago, when Madison was in college, she used our attic as her storage facility. She filled it with canvases, hundreds of them. She left them there when she moved out. Abandoned assets." I felt a cold prickle on my skin. I remembered the attic. I remembered the dust and the heat. I remembered stacking the failures, the studies, the half-finished ideas against the eaves. I hadn't thought about them in years. "Well," my father said, "I decided it was time to liquidate the inventory. I showed them to our good friend Arthur here." He gestured to Sterling. Sterling nodded, looking smug. He took a sip of his wine. "And I am proud to announce," my father said, "that Arthur has purchased the early Madison Gray collection, 20 pieces, for a sum of $250,000. The room gasped. It was a theatrical gasp. Then there was applause. People clapped their hands. They looked at me with new respect. Suddenly, I wasn't just the daughter. I was a commodity. I was a stock that had split. I sat frozen. $250,000. For the trash in the attic. For the practice runs. It didn't make sense. Those paintings were terrible. They were exercises, anatomy drills, color wheels. "That's wonderful, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silence of the applause it carried. "I'll send you the routing number for my account." My father laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh. He shook his head. "Oh, Madison," he said. "Always the comedian. No, no. You misunderstand." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. He looked directly at me. "The check is made out to me," he said. The room went still again. "Consider it repayment," he said, "for 18 years of room and board, for the tuition at that art school, for the braces on your teeth and the clothes on your back. Call it a raising fee. Call it back rent. You lived here for free, you stored your things for free. Now the account is settled." He beamed at the guests. "It's only fair, isn't it? A return on the capital expenditure of parenthood." The guests laughed. It started as a nervous titter, then grew into genuine laughter. They understood this logic. They understood ledgers. To them, children were investments, and finally Richard had cashed out. "Fair is fair," Mr. Henderson shouted. "Good business, Richard." "To the raising fee," someone else toasted. I looked at my mother. She was smiling. She took a sip of her wine. She didn't look at me. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist. She was complicit. She had probably helped him pick out the paintings. I looked at Sterling. He was the only one not laughing. He was reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a check. It was a cashier's check. I could see the blue watermark from where I sat. He placed it on the table and slid it toward my father. "$250,000, Sterling said. His voice was thick. "A steal, really. I've had my guys look at the market. Your name is starting to pop up in the galleries downtown Madison. These early works, they're raw. They're visceral." He looked at me with a greasy kind of admiration. "But it wasn't just the paint," Sterling said. "I'm a detail man. I look for the mark of the maker. And these—" He shook his head impressed. "The signatures alone are worth the price. Bold, distinctive. You can see the confidence in the hand. You signed them like you knew you were going to be famous." The world stopped. The sound of the room faded away. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, the crackle of the fire. It all dropped into a deep well of silence. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. It sounded like the ocean in winter. I stared at Sterling's mouth. I replayed his words, the signatures, bold, distinctive. I had never signed those paintings. I knew this with the certainty that I knew my own name. I never signed a study. I never signed a practice piece. In art school, the rule was absolute. You sign a work when it is finished, when you stand by it, when you claim it. Those canvases in the attic were abandoned. They were anonymous failures. I had left them blank in the corners. I looked at the check on the table. Then I looked at my father. He was tucking the check into his tuxedo pocket. He caught my eye. He winked. It was a small conspiratorial wink. He thought I would play along. He thought I would be so embarrassed, so cowed by his power and his money and his guests, that I would let it slide. He thought I would let him sell my name. He had forged my signature. He hadn't just stolen the art. He had altered it. He had taken a brush, dipped it in paint, and written Madison Gray on 20 canvases. He had committed a crime. He had committed fraud. And he had done it because he didn't think I had the spine to stop him. He thought I was just an asset to be managed. My hand was gripping the stem of my wine glass. I squeezed it hard. I felt the glass flex. It was fragile, but it was hard. "Bold," I whispered. "What was that, dear?" Sterling asked. He was cutting another piece of beef. "You said the signatures were bold," I said. My voice was steady. It didn't sound like my voice. It sounded like a stranger's. "Very," Sterling said. "Black paint, bottom right corner, unmistakable." I looked at my father. The smile was frozen on his face. He saw something in my eyes. He saw the shift. He saw the moment the daughter disappeared and the stranger arrived. "Show me," I said. "Madison, don't be tedious," my mother said. "Let the men finish their business." "Show me," I said again. I stood up. The chair scraped loud against the wood floor. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "If you bought my work, Arthur, I want to see it. I want to see these bold signatures." My father stood up too. He put a hand out, palm down, a gesture to lower the temperature. "Now, Maddie," he said. "Let's not make a scene. We're having a nice dinner." I'm not making a scene, I said. I'm making an inquiry. Where are they? They're in the study, Sterling said. He looked confused. He didn't understand the tension. He thought this was artist temperament. I have them stacked up, ready to load into the truck. Let's go to the study, I said. I walked away from the table. I didn't look back. I heard chairs scraping. I heard murmurs. I heard my father's heavy footsteps following me. He was angry now. I could feel his anger radiating like heat. But I didn't care. I walked through the hallway past the wreaths and the garlands. I walked toward the study. I was walking toward the end of my life as their daughter. I was walking toward the truth. The study was a room built for men who wanted to feel important. The walls were lined with books that had never been opened, bound in red and brown leather. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and the humidors on the desk. My father switched on the overhead light. It was a harsh, brassy light that made everyone look older. The guests crowded into the doorway, spilling over the threshold. They were quiet now. The laughter had died in the dining room. They were predators sensing a shift in the wind. They knew that something more interesting than dinner was about to happen. They held their wine glasses against their chests like shields. Arthur Sterling walked to the far wall. There was a stack of canvases leaning against the wainscoting. They were unframed. They looked raw and cheap against the expensive wallpaper. He looked at me, then at my father, trying to regain the jovial atmosphere of the toast. "Here we are," Sterling said. "The collection." He reached for the first canvas in the stack and turned it around. He held it up with two hands, displaying it to the room like a trophy. It was a study of a horse. I remembered painting it. I was 19. I was in a drafty studio in Philadelphia trying to understand the musculature of the flank. I had painted it quickly, angry at my own inability to get the proportions right. The horse looked stiff, its legs too thick, its neck too short. It was a failure. I had tossed it into the burn pile before I moved out, but my mother must have saved it, thinking anything with paint on it was worth keeping. But I wasn't looking at the horse. I was looking at the bottom right corner. There, in stark, wet-looking black paint, was a signature Madison Gray. The letters were looped and flourished. The M had a high peak. The G swept down with a theatrical curl. It was a signature that demanded attention. It was a signature that screamed importance. It was not my signature. I felt a strange sensation in my stomach, like I was falling in an elevator. It was a mix of nausea and absolute crystalline clarity. I walked closer. I could see the texture of the black paint. It sat on top of the varnish layer I had applied years ago. It was fresh. It hadn't had time to cure properly. "You like it?" Sterling asked. "Dynamic, isn't it?" I didn't answer him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. The shaking had stopped. I unlocked the screen and opened my inventory app. I kept a record of every piece I had ever finished, every piece I had sold, and every piece I had destroyed. It was the neurotic habit of a professional. I tapped the screen, scrolling back to 2016, the year I painted the horse. "Arthur," I said. My voice was low. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the wine fridge in the corner. "Do you know what provenance is?" Sterling blinked. "Of course, it's the history, the paper trail." "Right," I said. "And do you know what authentication is?" "Madison, stop this," my father snapped. He moved toward me, his face flushing a darker shade of red. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing us." "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed," I said. I held up the phone. "This is my archive, cloud-based, time-stamped. I have a record of this painting." I turned the screen so Sterling could see. There was a photo of the horse painting leaning against a brick wall in my college studio. "Read the notes, Arthur," I said. Sterling squinted. He read aloud, his voice halting. "Untitled study, horse anatomy, acrylic on canvas, status discarded, unsigned." He looked up at me. "Unsigned, unsigned," I repeated. "And look at the date, November 2016. I turned back to the painting he was holding. I pointed to the black signature. "That signature is fresh," I said. "Acrylic paint takes 20 minutes to dry to the touch, but it takes weeks to fully cure. If you smell it, Arthur, I bet you can still smell the binder. Sterling leaned in. He sniffed the corner of the canvas. He pulled back his nose, wrinkling. It smells like chemicals, he said. It smells like paint, I said. New paint. On a 9-year-old canvas. So you signed it recently? Sterling asked, looking at my father. Richard said you prepped them for sale. I haven't been in this house in 2 years, I said. I didn't sign that. My father laughed. It was a loud, desperate sound. She's being dramatic. It's an artist thing. She forgets. She came by, she signed them, she forgot. Who cares when it was signed? It's her name. It's not my hand, I said. I looked at my father. I looked him dead in the eye. That's your handwriting, Dad. The air left the room. The guests shifted their shoes, scuffing on the rug. This was no longer a business deal. This was a crime scene. Don't be ridiculous, Richard spat. It's a signature. It's the family name. I wrote it for you because you weren't here to do it yourself. I was helping you. You were forging a signature to increase the valuation, I said. You told Arthur the signatures were bold. You sold him the early collection based on the premise that I, the artist, had validated these works. But I didn't. I turned to the guests. I saw Mr. Henderson, the partner. He was looking at the floor. He knew the law. These are studies, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I use student-grade paints, Potters & Sons Academy acrylics. They have a high acid content. In 5 years, that white horse will turn yellow. In 10 years, the paint will crack and flake off the canvas. They are not archival. They are garbage. I looked back at Sterling. He was holding the painting like it was a dead rat. You paid $250,000 for garbage, I said. But the quality isn't the problem. The problem is the fraud. Fraud, my father shouted. How dare you? I gave you life. I paid for that paint. It's my property. The canvas is your property, I said. The physical object is yours. You can burn it. You can throw it in the trash. But the intellectual property, the name, that's mine. And the moment you signed my name to it to sell it for a profit, you committed forgery. I took a step toward Sterling. If you take these paintings, Arthur, you are knowingly purchasing counterfeit goods. The art world is small. If you try to resell these or insure them, the appraisers will call me, and I will tell them exactly what I am telling you now. I did not sign them. They are fakes. Sterling's face went pale. He looked at the check that was still in my father's pocket. The check that represented a steal, a smart deal, a victory. Now it represented a liability. Richard, Sterling said. His voice was cold. It was the voice of a man who stopped being a friend and started being a litigant. Arthur, listen to me, my father pleaded. He wiped sweat from his forehead. She's hysterical. She's ungrateful. It's the same name, Gray. I am a Gray. She is a Gray. What difference does it make who held the brush? It makes $1 million of difference in court, I said. It's called attribution fraud. And since you announced the sale to a room full of witnesses, I gestured to the silent crowd behind me. And since you accepted a check over state lines, that's wire fraud. My father stared at me. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at my mother. She was standing by the bookshelf clutching her velvet dress. She looked terrified. Not for me, but for the house, for the reputation. You would do that, my father whispered. You would ruin us over a few doodles. You tried to sell my reputation for $250,000, I said. You didn't ask me. You didn't offer me a share. You just took it. You thought my name was just another asset in your portfolio. You thought you owned me. I walked over to the stack of paintings. I looked at the next one. It was a landscape. A bad one. And there in the corner was the same forged signature. The same loop. The same lie. I am not an asset, I said. I am the artist, and the artist has the final say on authenticity. I looked at Sterling. You have a choice, Arthur. You can walk out of here with your check and your reputation intact, or you can take these paintings, and I will issue a public statement tomorrow morning disavowing the entire collection. I will list them as forgeries in the art loss register. They will be worth 0. And you will be the man who got conned by Richard Gray." Sterling dropped the painting. It hit the floor with a clatter. He didn't care. He wiped his hands on his expensive pants as if the paint had sullied him. "I didn't sign up for this," Sterling said. "I buy clean assets. This is a mess." He turned to my father. The look of admiration was gone. It was replaced by the cold, dead look of a man cutting a loss. "Give me the check, Richard." "Arthur, please," my father said. "We can work this out. I can get her to sign them. I can make her sign them." He lunged toward me. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was hard, painful. "You will sign them," he hissed. "You will fix this, after everything I did for you." I didn't pull away. I let him hold my wrist. I let the room see the violence in his grip. I let them see the desperation. "Let go," I said quietly. "Sign them," he shouted. Spittle flew from his mouth. "Sign them, or so help me God. I will." "You will what?" I asked. "Evict me. I don't live here. Cut me off. I pay my own bills." "You have nothing on me, Dad. The leverage is gone." I twisted my arm, breaking his grip. It was a simple move one I had learned in a self-defense class in the city. He stumbled back, colliding with the desk. A lamp wobbled. "Give him the check," I said. My father looked at the guests. He saw the judgment in their eyes. He saw the end of his social standing. He saw the story that would be whispered at the club tomorrow. Richard Gray tried to sell fakes to Arthur Sterling. Richard Gray forged his daughter's name. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the check. He didn't hand it to Sterling. He dropped it on the desk. Sterling snatched it up. He tore it in half, then in quarters. The sound of the tearing paper was the loudest thing in the world. It sounded like a bone breaking. "I think I'm leaving," Sterling said. "And Richard, don't call my office." He walked out of the study, pushing past the silent guests. One by one, the others followed. They didn't say goodbye. They just turned and left, retreating from the smell of failure. I stood alone with my parents in the study. The paintings were scattered on the floor. The early Madison Gray collection lay in a heap, worthless, exposed. My father leaned against the desk, breathing hard. My mother was crying a soft, pathetic sound. I looked at the horse painting on the floor. I looked at the signature that wasn't mine. I felt a profound sense of sadness, but under that something harder, something like steel. I had burned the bridge, but for the first time I was standing on solid ground. The front door closed for the last time. It was a heavy sound, a thud that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in the pit of the stomach. I heard the engines starting outside, the Mercedes, the Range Rovers, the town cars. They revved in the cold air, a chorus of expensive machinery fleeing a disaster. I listened to the gravel crunching under tires. I listened until the last engine faded down the driveway, and the only sound left was the wind rattling the window panes in the study. The house was silent. It was the kind of silence that comes after a gunshot. It was ringing and empty. The smell of the room had changed. The expensive cologne and the perfume were fading, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of fear and the stale odor of the cheese plate that sat untouched on the sideboard. My father pushed himself off the desk. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. His tuxedo shirt was damp with sweat under the arms. His face was a map of broken capillaries. He walked to the window and looked out at the taillights disappearing into the dark. He didn't look at me. He looked at the money driving away. "You realize what you've done," he said. His voice was flat. It wasn't a question. "I told the truth," I said. He turned around slowly. His eyes were wide and wet. "The truth. You think they care about the truth. You think Arthur Sterling got where he is by caring about the truth." He walked to the sideboard and poured himself a scotch. His hand was shaking so badly the bottle clicked against the glass. He drank it in one swallow and poured another. "He was going to sue you, Dad," I said. "If I hadn't stopped it now, he would have found out later." and then he would have taken the house. He wouldn't have found out, Richard shouted. The glass slammed down on the wood. Nobody looks that close. It's paint on canvas. It's a commodity. I had a deal. I had a handshake. And you gutted me. In front of the board. In front of the club. My mother stepped forward. She had stopped crying. Now she just looked cold. Her hands were clasped in front of her waist, holding onto her composure like it was a railing on a sinking ship. "We raised you better than this," she said. Her voice was thin and sharp like a wire. "To shame your father. To humiliate us in our own home. On Christmas. You invited a buyer to Christmas dinner," I said. "You turned the holiday into an auction." "We turned it into an opportunity," my father roared. "For you. Do you think we wanted the money for us? We have money. This was for the family. For the legacy." He began to pace. He walked a tight circle on the Persian rug, stepping over the fallen painting of the horse. $250,000, he muttered. "Gone, just like that. Because you have principles. Because you're an artist." He spat the word out. "Tell me, Madison, how much did you make this year? With your real paintings, with your authentic work?" "That doesn't matter," I said. "It matters to me," he yelled. "I paid for the lessons. I paid for the studio time in college. I paid for the supplies. I paid for the food in your mouth for 18 years. I kept a ledger, Madison. In my head, I kept a ledger. And the column in the red is a mile long. Tonight was the night we finally got into the black. Tonight was the night you finally paid off." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike and to tie my shoes. I saw him clearly for the first time. He was not a father. He was a creditor. And I was a bad debt. "I am not an investment," I said. "You can't short sell your daughter." "I can do whatever I want with my property," he said. "And those paintings were mine. They were in my house, in my attic. I stored them. I preserved them." "You forged them," I said. "I improved them." He gestured wildly at the heap of canvases. "I gave them value. Without that name, without that signature, they are just colored rags. I added the brand. I did the work." He looked at me with genuine disgust. "You're selfish. That's what you are. You'd rather be right than be helpful. You'd rather see your father ruined than bend a little. It's a signature, Madison. Just ink. It means nothing." "It means everything," I said. I looked at the paintings. The horse, the landscape, the bowl of fruit. They were clumsy and young. They were the work of a girl who was trying to learn how to see the world. And in the corner of each one, that black, confident lie. It made me sick. It felt like he had reached into my past and rewritten it to suit his portfolio. "You don't understand ownership," my mother said. She was picking up a napkin from the floor. She smoothed it out obsessively. "You think you own yourself, but you don't. You belong to this family. You belong to this community, and you have damaged us." "I don't belong to anyone," I said. "You're a child," my father said. "A selfish, arrogant child playing at being poor in the city. But when the checks bounce, who do you call? When you need a co-signer, who do you call?" "I haven't asked you for money in 6 years," I said. "But you will," he said. "You will fail, and you will come crawling back. And we would have been here. We would have had the capital to help you. But now Arthur is going to talk. He's going to tell everyone. Henderson heard it. The wives heard it. Richard Gray is a fraud. Richard Gray sells fakes. Do you know what that does to a firm? Do you know what that does to our liquidity?" He slumped against the desk. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a heavy gray despair. "You've killed us," he whispered. "You've killed the golden goose." I looked at them. They were small people in a big room. They were trapped in a cage of their own, making a cage built of status and perception. They were terrified of the world seeing them as they were ordinary. "I didn't kill anything," I said. "I just turned on the lights." I walked over to the sideboard. There was a silver tray with crackers and a block of hard cheese. Next to the cheese was a knife. It was a small knife with a pearl handle and a sharp serrated steel blade. It was a tool for parties, a tool for polite society. I picked it up. The handle was cool and smooth. "What are you doing?" my mother asked. Her voice hitched. I didn't answer. I walked back to the painting of the horse. I knelt down. The canvas was rough under my fingertips. I looked at the signature one last time. Madison Gray. It looked like a logo. It looked like a brand on cattle. "Madison put that down," my father said. He stood up alarmed. "Those are still. They might be worth something. Without the signature, maybe we can sell them as attributed to. Maybe we can." He was still bargaining. He was still trying to find the angle. I pushed the point of the knife into the canvas. It made a popping sound as it punctured the fabric. "No!" my father shouted. I pulled the knife down. The sound was a loud tearing rip. It sounded like a zipper opening. I sliced through the black paint. I sliced through the M and the G. I cut a triangle out of the corner of the painting. The piece of canvas curled up, detached, dead. I stood up and moved to the next one. The landscape. "Stop it!" my mother screamed. "Richard, stop her!" My father didn't move. He watched with a horrified fascination. He was watching his capital evaporate. I knelt and cut again. Rip. The sound was satisfying. It was the sound of a contract being voided. I cut the signature out of the landscape. I tossed the scrap of painted canvas onto the Persian rug. I moved to the next one, a still life of a skull. Rip. "You're crazy," my father said. "You're insane." "I'm correcting the record," I said. I worked quickly. I moved down the stack. I didn't cut the images. I didn't destroy the horse or the trees or the fruit. I only cut the lie. I cut the bottom right corner off of every single canvas. The pile of scraps grew on the floor, little triangles of deception. My parents stood and watched. They were powerless. They couldn't stop me because they knew deep down that they had no right to stop me. The paintings were mine. The name was mine. The hand that held the knife was mine. I reached the last one. It was a self-portrait. I had painted it looking in a mirror when I was 20. The face in the painting was unsure, the eyes wide and seeking. But the signature my father had added was bold and arrogant. It didn't fit the face. I drove the knife in. I cut the name away. I left the girl in the painting nameless. I left her free. I stood up. I wiped the blade of the knife on my dress. I placed the knife on the desk next to the empty glass of scotch. The room was quiet again. The floor was littered with the confetti of my revenge. The paintings leaned against the wall, maimed but honest. They were no longer the early Madison Gray collection. Now they were just old pictures by a student who didn't know who she was yet. They were worth nothing. And because they were worth nothing, they could not be sold. They could not be used. They were safe. "There," I said. "Now you don't have to worry about the lawsuit. There's no evidence, no fraud, just some damaged goods." My father looked at the scraps on the floor. He looked at me. His face was gray. He looked like a man who had bet the house on a horse that broke its leg at the gate. "Get out," he said. He whispered it. "I'm going," I said. "Don't come back," he said. He looked up and his eyes were full of a cold, hard hate. "You are not welcome here. You are not my daughter. You are a stranger." "I think I've been a stranger for a long time," I said. "You have nothing," my mother said. She was trembling. "You leave this house and you have nothing. No family, no inheritance, no safety net." "I have my work," I said. "And I have my name, the real one." I looked at the room one last time. I looked at the leather books and the heavy curtains and the trap of the good life. It felt like a museum. It felt like a place where things went to die and be catalogued. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the study. I walked down the hallway. The house was cooling down. The heat was turning off. I could feel the draft coming from the front door. I walked past the dining room where the table was still littered with the remains of the feast. The roast beef was cold. The wine was settling in the glasses. It looked like a banquet for ghosts. I didn't look back. I didn't feel the weight of the debt anymore. I felt light. I felt like the empty space on the wall where the landscape used to be. I was blank, and I was ready to be filled with something true. I walked to the closet and took my coat. The hanger rattled against the rod, a lonely wooden sound in the quiet hall. I put the coat on. The wool was cold from hanging near the drafty door. I buttoned it to the chin. I picked up my bag. It was light. I had brought very little and I was leaving with even less. I didn't say goodbye to the house. The house was just wood and plaster and wiring. It didn't care who lived in it or who left it. It only cared about being heated and painted and insured. I opened the front door and the winter air hit me like a slap. It was clean air, sharp and 0 degrees. It smelled of snow and pine trees, not stale perfume and lies. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The latch clicked. It was a solid, final click. I walked down the steps. The salt my father had spread on the walkway crunched under my boots. It was pink rock salt looking like crushed gems in the porch light. I reached the rental car. It was covered in a thin sheet of fresh snow that had fallen during dinner. I used my gloved hand to sweep it off the windshield. The snow was light and dry. I got in and turned the key. The engine hesitated, then caught. It was a rough mechanical sound, a good sound. I turned on the heater. It blew cold air at first, smelling of plastic, but I knew it would get warm. I put the car in reverse. I backed out of the space between the ghosts of the luxury cars that had already fled. I turned the wheel and pointed the nose toward the road. I drove down the long driveway. The high beams cut a tunnel through the darkness. The trees on either side were tall and black, watching me go. I reached the stone pillars at the entrance of the estate. I didn't look back. I turned onto the county road. The tires hummed on the asphalt. The snowplows had been through, and the road was a black ribbon winding through the white hills. I drove for 10 miles without thinking. I just watched the road and felt the wheel in my hands. The heater kicked in, filling the small cabin with heat. I began to thaw. My hands stopped aching. My shoulders dropped. The tension that had held me together for the last 3 hours began to dissolve, leaving behind a dull, rhythmic exhaustion. I thought about the money. $250,000. It was a number that could fix everything. It could buy a studio with north-facing windows. It could buy canvas by the roll and paint by the gallon. It could buy time. It could buy 5 years of not worrying about rent. It was a fortress of money, but it was a fortress built on sand. If I had taken it, I would have had to live inside the lie. I would have had to be the daughter who painted the masterpieces in the attic. I would have had to smile when Arthur Sterling introduced me to his friends as the prodigy. I would have had to let my father own my history. The price was too high. The cost of the money was my hand. It was my eye. It was the ability to look at a blank canvas and know that whatever I put on it was mine. You cannot buy freedom with counterfeit coin. I had walked away poor, but I had walked away real. I merged onto the highway. The traffic was light. A few trucks, a few weary travelers trying to get home before midnight. The city was 60 miles south. I wasn't going to the city yet. I needed to stop. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't a destination, just a pause. I saw a sign for a diner. It was a blue neon sign buzzing and flickering against the night sky. The Summit Diner. It looked like a silver bullet train car parked on the side of the road. I pulled off the exit. The parking lot was empty except for a semi-truck and a police cruiser. I parked under a yellow street lamp. Inside the diner smelled of coffee and frying bacon and wet floor mop. It was a warm, greasy human smell. I sat in a booth by the window. The vinyl seat was cracked and taped with silver duct tape. It felt honest. The table was formica patterned with little boomerangs. A waitress came over. She was older, maybe 50. She had tired eyes and hair that was dyed a color that didn't exist in nature, a kind of dark cherry red. Her name tag said Bev. She held a pot of coffee. "Just coffee?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, like she had been smoking since she was 12. "Please," I said. "And maybe some pie. Cherry." You got it, hun. She poured the coffee. It was black and hot, and steam rose from it. She walked away to cut the pie. I wrapped my hands around the mug, the heat soaked into my palms. I took a sip. It was bitter and strong. It tasted like life. I watched Bev working behind the counter. She was wiping down the stainless steel. She moved with a practiced efficiency. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just doing the work. She had dignity. More dignity than anyone in my father's house. I reached into my bag and pulled out a pen. It was a simple black ballpoint. I didn't have a sketchbook, so I pulled a napkin from the metal dispenser. It was thin, cheap paper. I started to draw. I didn't look down at the paper much. I looked at Bev. I watched the line of her jaw, the way her shoulders slumped, the way her hair was pinned back. I drew the tiredness in her eyes. I drew the strength in her hands. I used the ballpoint to make quick, cross-hatched shadows. The ink bled a little into the soft paper, making the lines soft and velvety. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a sketch on a napkin in a roadside diner at 1 a.m. But it was true. It captured the moment. It captured the feeling of being awake when the world is asleep. It captured the specific, unique humanity of this woman. Bev came back with the pie. She set it down. She looked at the napkin. "Is that me?" she asked. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "It is," I said. She looked at it for a long time. She wiped her hands on her apron. "You got the nose right, and the hair. It's nice. Nobody ever drew me before." "Keep it," I said. "Really?" "Yeah, it's yours." She picked up the napkin, carefully holding it by the corners so she wouldn't smudge the ink. She looked at it like it was a check for $1 million. "You should sign it," she said, "in case you get famous." I looked at the napkin. I looked at the drawing. I picked up the pen. In the bottom right corner, I wrote my name, Madison Gray. I didn't use the flourish. I didn't make the M high or the G theatrical. I wrote it in my normal, small, cramped handwriting. It was the signature I put on checks. It was the signature I put on leases. It was the signature of a woman who pays her own way. "There," I said. "Thanks, hun," Bev said. She tucked the napkin into the pocket of her apron. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," I said. I ate the pie. It was sweet and warm. I finished the coffee. I put a $20 bill on the table. It was too much for coffee and pie, but it felt right. It wasn't charity. It was payment for the model. It was a transaction between equals. I put my coat back on. I walked out into the cold night. The wind had died down. The sky was clear now, and I could see the stars. They were hard and bright and very far away. I got back into the rental car. I started the engine. I turned on the headlights. I put the car in drive and pulled onto the highway, heading south toward the city, toward the studio, toward the work that was waiting for me. I had nothing in the trunk but my clothes. I had no inheritance. I had no safety net. I drove into the dark, and I was not afraid. As Madison drives south into the clear night, she leaves the artifice behind for a life that is authentically hers. If you found satisfaction in her reclaiming her name, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more narratives like this. We read every single comment of your thoughts, so tell us below if you agree with her choice. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.